So this week, I think it's pretty clear the kind of vibe we wanted to go for. Once again, obviously, we had a number of options to do this with. If you want to start with Crouching Tiger, we could have done, that whole thing that kind of spawned right after Crouching Tiger and its popularity with stuff like House of Flying Daggers and Curse of the Golden Flower, which are great movies, but I wanted to take just a little bit of a detour instead and go a bit farther back, almost a decade actually, and show off another extremely influential movie in this kind of same vein. And also, it's just always kind of struck me. I remember shortly after Crouching Tiger came out, and Once Upon a Time in China was still... Obviously, it's a movie that's still discussed, for sure. It's not like some completely obscure thing, but it's... I've often heard Once Upon a Time in China referred to as Crouching Tiger for the Underground, despite the fact that it is almost a decade older. But that did kind of always stick with me and always did kind of strike me. So even though they're not completely and totally alike, even though they are set around the same era, they're still two movies that have always in my head kind of gone together. So I felt like it was kind of fitting enough to do that as opposed to one of the more newer choices we could have had. So to start off, let's start with Crouching Tiger actually, the significantly more popular one, which is it's a movie that really kind of... I don't remember much about that time frame back in 2000. I do remember we had a few friends that saw it and talked about the amazingness of it, that were into this. But at the time I wasn't really quite sure what it was, and it did seem weird to me that a foreign movie would break out so much into the mainstream, even if it's, an action and martial arts movie. Still, it seemed like kind of a weird time, even though, obviously, we are right on the cusp of The Matrix had just been the year before, which, of course, these movies share a choreographer, so it makes sense. And this way of action was kind of like this whole gravity-defying thing was something that was still very new. And the way it was kind of breaking through to all audiences. And because when we start off here, it's obviously nowadays it is known for its high-flying action and all that stuff and being this big, gigantic, enormous martial arts movie. But the thing is when you sit down and watch it, you realize... When you look at, like, American action movies, typically there's always something to immediately pull you in. There's always some big action scene to kind of start the thing off with a bang, and then it kind of slows down and gets into its groove and then does what it does. Here, we don't start with a bang. We start with our characters and we start with the story, and it's a good 15 minutes into the movie. For a movie that's a mere 2 hours, that's a pretty big chunk of time for being the start of the movie. Where there's no big opening, and it's all about these characters and how these characters relate to each other, and where they stand with each other, and what their motivations are, and we get this for quite a while, and then 15 minutes in or so, it just kind of grabs you and completely defies your expectations of what you expect from a movie like this. Where we know we're expecting a martial arts movie, but we're watching it and we're getting all this character, we're getting backstories, we're getting all this stuff, history on the sword, and who it belongs to, and where it's going to be going, and who wants it, and what happened long ago that's going to ultimately tie into all this. And then suddenly, a thief flies through the air. And this is when you realize, oh... And you realize that this is Ang Lee kind of combining, like, he's not, like, we've talked about before of how versatile Ang Lee is. Like, before this he had done Sense and Sensibility and The Ice Storm, and then after this he went on to do, like, Hulk, but then, like, Brokeback, Life of Pi, Lost Caution, Billy Lynn. Movies that are always different. He did a Western with Ride with the Devil with Tobey Maguire. But what he's done here is he's kind of taken a combination of things, where he has not just made a martial arts movie, he's made this epic fantasy, just whole concoction, this whole hybrid of genres, and just made this giant, massive movie, and made it something that looks familiar, but at the same time is unlike anything we've ever seen before. Like, we've seen movies set in this time with these kind of very bare bones plots, like they're like in another movie, in a lesser movie, the plot would just be about the sword, and it wouldn't really be so much about the characters. The characters are such a massive part of this movie. And it would just stop there, and it would be these fight scenes. But not only does it defy expectations by giving us so much character to work with, but it's also just when you see this first moment of somebody flying from one place to another, and then it turns out during the action scenes, that's just how they move. There's no explanation for it. It's nothing. It's just something we immediately accept as soon as we see it, that this is how the characters can move in this world, and this is how they fight, and how they can just glide from one place to the other. And it's seriously insane, and the whole idea that there was really no CGI involved. It's pretty much all wire work. Like, I think Ang Lee said the only thing they used computers for was to take out the wires, and that's pretty much it. And to the point that it's mostly the actual actors as well, which is really impressive. But that is another thing too, where not only do we have all this strong character work, but we also have these actors that are able to kind of bring that gravitas to their performance while also having the athleticism to do what is required for these big action scenes. Because this is a movie where it's all, like, the whole importance of the action, not just the glorious appearance of it, and the unlike anything we've ever seen before appearance of it, but also the story is kind of told through the action. Like, that's really where we get our strong storytelling, because obviously on the dialogue front is kind of this movie's weak point. It does have some very laughable exposition in it. Like I was talking about, it is nice for getting all this character stuff, but the exposition is flat out laughable. Like the moment when he's talking about his backstory and all that, and they're saying what they're going to do, and he has to stop and say, "But first, we must go to Master's grave, and it has been years since he was murdered by Jade Fox." And he just speaks so straightforward about all the events that have happened in the past that are going to be important now. However, once again, it is a subtitled movie, so maybe there's something lost in translation. Maybe the dialogue sounds much better in its native language, and when you try to kind of put it back together again to form it into English, there's probably something lost in there, and it probably does sound better if you understand the language. But then again, maybe that's why the dialogue is so. Because there's also those moments too, whenever they have a line in mid-battle, it's something very mundane to, like, "Give me back the sword," or "I'm gonna whatever," and it's one of those cases where you realize, yeah, this is a story that's much better told through its action, because when you watch them fight, you can see the experience or the inexperience, and you can see, you know, the grudges and the whole revenge aspect of it when Chow Yun-fat going after her. And that's really where the strong point is, and that's what makes it so great, that the action is so grand, because it makes the movie so big on an emotional level without necessarily having to have a lot of people just emoting when they say dialogue or whatever. But that's not to say that the performances can't be strong when they're just speaking. Chow Yun-fat's scene with about the cycle of bloodshed continues is a really good moment for him. However, I say all this, and while I do notice I'm saying I appreciate the time we get on these characters, here's where a problem for me lies, and that is that even though we do get so much character work, I feel like all the time the characters get devoted to them, they're still not quite engaging enough to hold out through the story. And the thing, because it's like, we do understand where they're all coming from, we do understand their motivations, and that should really be a great foundation for this movie to lie on. But the trouble is even though this action is spectacular, and even though that's where the strong points lie, and we can tell where characters have come from just by watching them move, there's still something, I feel, that just lacks an impact. And you look at it, stuff like this, like, and the problem with that is that how great the action is just kind of highlights this more, because those scenes when the action isn't happening, it's like, you can so appreciate how much thought they put into these characters, but there's just still, it just feels like there's something missing. And that goes into, let's go into the romance subplot. And honestly, it just feels like this whole romance subplot is, while it's great for character development, it just feels so sprung on us, like very, very abruptly, where we meet him, the bandit that she met in the desert, that she falls in love with, and then just the next half hour of the movie or so is a flashback, just completely out of nowhere. And I can understand how this would work if the movie had a certain flow to it, where it's like 1 minute it's this present day story about the sword and how she is actually cahooting with Jade Fox and all that, and how she may be actually surpassing her, and then we flow into her backstory. But the trouble is the story itself is never quite engaging enough to make that flow seem seamless. For me, when I'm watching the flashback scene, I'm never not saying, good lord, it feels like we were watching a totally different movie 20 minutes ago. And it's just kind of like, I have to stop and say, how did we end up here? And how did we... so I do understand why it's told that way and why it's there, but I don't think it works effectively as far as it kind of gives the movie a bit of an incoherent feel. Like I said, I do understand how it could be seen as it just all flows nicely, the way we kind of flow into her character being a bit of a centerpiece here. But it's just never not been totally jarring to me, the kind of detour we take. So I feel like that's kind of a weaker point of the movie, even though it's supposed to be kind of the heart of the movie. Quite literally, it's the romance aspect of it, but it gives the whole thing this big center heart and emotion to it, where we really understand the drive of this character, and him too, really. I don't know, it's just something that's always kind of thrown me off, and I never feel like the movie recovers from it, for me, once we get back to where we were. And there's also stuff like, they do try to do certain things where there's kind of a lighter moment going on her character. The moment when she's supposedly posing as a guy, but she never doesn't look totally feminine. I don't know who that disguise was working on, but... and we have this scene where she goes in, and of course we know that she's typically high-end, so she goes into this place in disguise. And one of her mistakes is she goes into this kind of rundown restaurant and orders this really big, elaborate thing, and it's played for comedy, and it's like, this feels like something a Disney princess would do. Like, this feels like a scene right out of a Disney movie or something, where the character goes to the lesser place, but forgets where she came from. And then there's I do appreciate the action scene that kind of feels almost like an old-style bar fight from a Western or something. This scene where she just fucks everybody up, and it's played for comedy, despite the serious aspects of the movie we've gone to up to this point. And it's a nice kind of light moment right here in the middle, especially for this character, who we know is, like I said, cahooting with Jade Fox, so she kind of seems on the fence here, but, yeah, still, overall, though, I just feel like while I can understand the greatness, for sure, it's just always felt like there's something missing from me, and I think the flashback is what really does it in, where I think the movie just completely gets thrown off its path, and I understand, it's still part of a story as a whole, like, it all comes together, but I just feel like it never really comes back from just really taking a detour just all of a sudden, and then when it comes back, it never really... Like, it's basically lost me by that point. And while I still like it, and can certainly appreciate it on a technical front, as far as the story is concerned, and I know martial arts movies, people tend to say, well, the story's not as important when you just look at it as an achievement. But that's true. But the problem is the first half of this movie shows us that the strength of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is that it is this big, epic martial arts movie with all this high-flying action, but it tells its story in such a way that you don't normally see in movies like this, and does it in such a strong way, and really makes it a prominent factor in why we're seeing what we're seeing. Like, the action doesn't happen just for the sake of it. It's showing us, like, our character development we see in these fights more than we can ever see in expositional dialogue or people explaining what they've been through. And yeah, so I'm always kind of let down when we get to that point. But like I said, I take it certainly as this big influential achievement. Obviously, it didn't just defy expectations by making people fly. It also defied expectations by being a foreign martial arts movie that was an Oscar juggernaut. This movie got so many damn Oscar nominations, including Picture and Director. It ended up winning 4, as you can see right here, one of which was 4, and I think it was Cinematography, Score, and Production Design? Yes. Back then it was still called Art Direction, but yes. So I do appreciate all those aspects of it, and it is definitely this hugely influential thing, and it's just this achievement in visual storytelling for sure, and just really kind of broke this stuff into the mainstream in a very unexpected way. Like I said, it was right after The Matrix, so you can see that the action and the choreography and all that was a selling point for the mainstream, but still, it's still quite an achievement that you could get a movie with a story like this and characters like this that doesn't necessarily start off with a bang and doesn't immediately grab you in the traditional sense that a traditional action movie would. So yes, I definitely see where all the praise comes from, and I do know that a lot of the time it's not even often considered just one of, if not the best martial arts movie ever made, but there are a lot of people that will tell you that that's for movies in general, which is obviously extremely high praise, and I do appreciate it for what it is, but I can't necessarily say that I'm totally in love with it, so... but that brings us on over to Once Upon a Time in China, which showed us, we're talking about this breaking out thing, and this movie with Jet Li showed us the creation. This movie's basically, we're witnessing the creation of a superstar. And that was just in Hong Kong at the time. Like, this was, like, it was still a good 7 years before he was going to be in Lethal Weapon 4 and be brought to us. But then this is also, once this movie started to get attention, this kind of international status with Jet Li kind of started to fall into place before he was in his first American movie with Lethal Weapon 4, of all things. And obviously, we're taking this character, in this kind of like this kind of folk hero with, Wong Fei-hung, who is, obviously, in particular, he's been in a lot of different stories. In movies, I think he's most popular, besides this franchise, is Jackie Chan's Drunken Master movies. With there was obviously, which I wasn't necessarily huge on. The first one is fine, and then there's Drunken Master 2, which is nowadays known as The Legend of Drunken Master, where they like re-released it, and it's like the white cover, and he's being all Jackie Chan on it. I didn't really care for that one, despite the odd following it's gotten, especially when it was re-released. I do think this is definitely a way to use that character, because this is a movie that feels so much just like a legend when you're watching it. And just the use of all that stuff. The title is, like, it's one of those titles where it seems like it must be generic, because we already had Once Upon a Time in the West, Once Upon a Time in America, and all that stuff. But that title is perfect, because this feels like a story that's being told to you that's like a legend. And I really love the way they do that, and how it's like this whole... how there's hardly a plot. There is so much going on in this movie, and there are so many different kind of... like, for a while there, it's seriously just a series of stories and set pieces that just kind of go one after the other. But they do kind of all end up tying together, and the way those stories kind of all weave, and how they all eventually kind of find their place and make this one big whole. It's like they spend the whole movie making a quilt, and then at the very end, when we reach our climax, we finally get to see that thing in a whole once it's all been stitched together. And it's just that, and you take a main character that has had so many different incarnations and put him in the center of this. It's just a really cool thing. It's just a really cool feel this whole movie has from beginning to end. And how we start off with this introduction. Obviously, it's his introduction in this movie, where he's just at one of these like lion dances, and he's able to. everything is disrupted because they think they're being attacked because of the fireworks. And while he's able to kind of fend this attack off, he's able to also take over the costume and jump around on the ropes and continue. It's like the perfect embodiment of the show must go on. And it's a perfect introduction to him and takes us right into this. And like I said, it's one of those cases where it really doesn't have a lot to do with anything. It's just, this is just a movie of great set pieces, just from the get-go. And like I said, while it still doesn't quite come together as this massively cohesive plot, the way it does kind of weave together and eventually get us to a point, it all feels like enough of a satisfying whole in general, that it doesn't necessarily feel like, because the way they introduce the different directions at just the right pace, like to the point to where it does feel like it's, you know, one thing after the other, and so on. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's jumping around everywhere. It does always kind of feel like, you do always kind of get this sense that it all has a point. And even if it doesn't, you're just way too entertained enough to really be thinking about it much. And that they're able to kind of pull off both of that is kind of cool. And they do kind of do, you know, the old stuff, like there's silly side characters and there's slapstick, which really just goes with this genre. It's always been there. And in this is a particular genre where everything about it is just so physical that slapstick has never seemed out of place. It's always made sense that these movies kind of have a comedic way about them and a slapstick way about them, because everything in the movie, the whole, you know, the most appealing aspects of it are just physicality and all that athleticism, and it just kind of fits right in, especially if you're going to have comic relief. The Ant 13 story also kind of feels very, like, it's one of those things that could feel kind of tacked on, but it just kind of, the way they kind of gradually and naturally work it into this movie, it doesn't feel kind of like Crouching Tiger. It doesn't feel like it's just put on us suddenly. It's very kind of gradually starts and then slowly kind of works its way into the plot as the movie goes. So I thought that was handled really well. Because love stories are usually where movies tend to fall apart, no matter what they are, no matter what genre they are, unless it's romance. But that's the thing, is we talk about the silly side characters and the slapstick, but the thing here is that this movie can be so brutal. Because here's the thing is, this movie knows the context of its action, and will adjust it accordingly, because there are moments where, for every time there's a scene of slapstick or, you know, a light scene, there's a scene like the opera slaughter, which is just absolutely brutal. But even the opera slaughter, they back up with that scene with Foom when he's getting into a fight with him, and they come in and try to break it up, and he just says, like, he's been hitting me since he got here. So there's always that nice balance, where there are action scenes where it just feels like people are, you know, getting lightly tapped or just kind of thrown to the side. And then there are scenes where it's so brutal, it's like you can feel every blow as an audience member that somebody takes. And then the way they kind of throw a wrench in this, where we know, you know, the martial arts and the flying and the ropes and all that. And then suddenly the villains have guns. And you realize, it just feels like such an intrusion on this, and it makes you, it really sets the villains up when that is introduced, and how it doesn't feel out of place at all. It feels like this is why, like, what's the tagline, like, a hero was never needed more, and it just really gives you that feeling that the stakes are incredibly high when you just see fighting and fighting and fighting, and then this opera scene happens, and then people are getting shot, and it's brutal, and it's dramatic, and they just really set the drama, and they really know when to do that and when to make it light, and it never seems out of place when they kind of blend one or one follows the other, because they're so familiar with context and how important that is. And I thought that was really well done. Obviously, one of the great aspects of this movie is, I don't know if it's, this DVD is the only means I have seen Once Upon a Time in China, so I don't know if it's this copy or if that's what the movie is. That whole grainy look, where this movie is 1991. This movie was made in 1991 and released in 1991. And it looks like a 70s Bruce Lee movie in aesthetic. Like, it looks old, even though it's the early 90s. And it feels like they're kind of it seems like an artistic choice with that and the dubbing. And the sound effects even too kind of have that quality about them. But the thing here about the dubbing is, for starters, I'm going to assume it's intentional, because there is like a whole English dubbed version of this that's like, this one's 2 hours and 14 minutes. I think the dubbed one's only like an hour 40. They cut like 35 minutes out of it and redubbed it in English. But in this version, there is still dubbing. Like, people, like, you know, the Chinese speak Chinese, the Americans speak English. But everybody still looks dubbed. And there's even that moment where one of the Americans says, or somebody says, "Damn you Yankees, you hit my ship." And the audio is like, "Damn you Yankees, you hit my ship." But when he says it, he just looks so bored. And he doesn't look like he's putting anything into it. It's like that clear. I almost feel like it's an artistic choice on purpose. I would like to think that. And it's almost kind of played for a comedic effect like that. Where even when somebody's speaking their own language, they look like they're not, and it just gives it this very old-fashioned vibe. Like I said, like the old Bruce Lee movies or something. But that's the thing, is that this movie is able to have those aspects, but it kind of surpasses the cheesiness that inspired it, because it really, while it has those moments in it, and you can appreciate it, where it kind of feels like one of the older, you know, kung fu movies or something. It still feels like something massive and something kind of important and something really incredibly dramatic, while also certainly having these comedic moments in it. And of course the action scenes are just off the wall insane. And obviously, I believe the most famous scene of the movie is the climax with the ladders, which I'm sure has been imitated many times. I think there's even a Jackie Chan movie that came later that kind of borrowed from this as well. If there's one problem I have, I was talking about that 2 hour and 14 minute runtime. Yeah, the movie's probably too long. The climax goes on for an eternity. It really does. But honestly, I just love the movie so much. It doesn't really... While it does kind of feel like it runs out of gas there towards the end, to keep up for as long as it does, and to keep you engrossed as it does, with all these different things jumping around, it's just really... It's just a really, really great movie. And I love that it was able to spawn a franchise of, like, what was it, like 5 sequels. There was a point in time, I think a couple of them, Jet Li was replaced, but then I think he showed up for the last one. It is Jet Li definitely in the second and third. And the way they were able to take this very simple recipe, like, it's a movie that you feel, when you look at it, it's like, yeah, I've seen this before. Like, I've seen this kind of stuff, like this kind of story, this kind of action and all that. But there's still something so distinctive about it that really makes it stand out as its own thing. Even being the start of a franchise, it still feels like its own distinctive thing. And just all that stuff put together just makes for, like, one hell of a movie. Something I do prefer to Crouching Tiger. I do think Once Upon a Time in China is a lot more fun, but I do understand, and, you know, has these characters that really stand out. Well, Crouching Tiger does too. But there's just something so... It's kind of like, when you watch Once Upon a Time in China, it's like one of those movies where it was like it was made by somebody that just loves this genre, that, like, lives and breathes this genre, and just really brought something to life that it's like a love letter to the time past, but is also totally feels like its own thing. And I think that just really makes it monumentally impressive. But I do, once again, very much appreciate Crouching Tiger for being this thing we had never seen before that just really blew away audiences. And especially for the time period that it was, and the way it kind of was able to break out into the mainstream in a way that most movies of its kind aren't able to. But my money will always go to Once Upon a Time in China in this instance, so... Yeah, that's what we have here. Once again, I do have... The next versus is actually going to be one of those ones where it's a movie I really love versus something I absolutely despise. So hopefully that's a little fun. I don't like the idea of revisiting said movie I despise, because I haven't seen it in almost 10 years. It came out in 2008 in theaters. That was the last time I saw it. But I found it for like 50 cents, and I was like, I'll just do this just to do it. Just to see what it looks like now. So we have that to look forward to. And obviously tomorrow you'll get a video with Dunkirk, The Beguiled, Free Fire,
and some other stuff. So that'll be fun. So yes, in the meantime, until then, that's it. We're done.